Hello and welcome to a special year-end edition of the France 24 debate. I'm François Picard. As the incoming U.S. administration ponders protectionism and isolationism, we're going to start by turning back the clock 100 years. In 1917, the world's currency was still the British pound, but that was about to change with the United States entering World War I. The Americans would tip the balance in a war that brought Europe to its knees and embark on the road to global superpower. Events on the Eastern Front were also shaping a new world order, with Russia concluding a separate peace with Germany and its allies before founding the Soviet Union. The USSR is now long gone, so is the Ottoman Empire, yet that year, 1917, weighs high on the minds with references to the past anytime you see handshakes like this one. On that score, it feels like a fickle time, by the way, for national interests. Big alliances seem to get undone and renewed according to what's in the news cycle. An economy is once again at a crossroads for us, and a changing world order then, perhaps a changing world order now. When Donald Trump talks of making America great again and Britain harks for Brexit, is it a cry for the nation state of old? How different is the nationalism of 1917 and the nationalism of 2017? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about a changing world order. With us, he was a spokesperson for Mikhail Gorbachev, Russian historian Andrei Grachev. It's the 25th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
Your latest book, published in French under the title Russia's Past is Unpredictable.
That's right.
Thank you for being with us. Also with us, literature professor Curtis Young, preparing a book and an exhibit on the Harlem Hellfighters, African-American soldiers in World War I. We'll go into details on that. I love the working title you have for the documentary project, When the Blues People Say America to France.
And the blues people sang America
sang
France.
Sang America to France. With books like 1,000 Years of Annoying the French, journalist Stephen Clark's always grappling with the then and now. His latest work is fiction, up to a point. It's called Merde in Europe. Nice to see you, Stephen. And from Boston, Stephen Wald, who teaches international affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us from across the Atlantic.
Nice to be with you.
1914, Stephen, ended the old world order. 1917 gave us an idea of what was to come, didn't it?
Certainly it did in two senses. First, 1917 really marks the United States' emergence as a major player in the world stage when it decides to intervene in the latter stages of World War I, the first time the United States had really sent substantial amounts of military power far from its shores with the purpose of trying to dictate events in Europe, and then, of course, is very actively involved in the Paris Peace Conference after the war. We also see, I think, in 1917, the emergence of what then transpires throughout much of the 20th century, namely the clash of several universalist ideologies. The Western ideology of liberalism, personified by the United States more than any other. In the Soviet case, Bolshevism or Marxism-Leninism as an alternative universalist ideology. And you would also perhaps add fascism in the interwar period and with Nazi Germany as yet a third model for how to organize society. And it's the struggle between those three models that plays itself out over the next 20 to 40 years.
The struggle that plays itself out, Stephen Clark, those universal ideologies, are they universal today?
Well, there was also another universal ideology going on, which was colonialism, because you shouldn't forget that during the First World War, Britain had its eye on Iraq and on Palestine. France and Britain wanted Germany's colonies in Africa, which they took straight after the First World War. So there were sort of other bigger world interests as well. Now the trouble is with world ideologies is that you really don't know which is which anymore. It doesn't seem to be political anymore.
It's à la carte?
Yeah, and it's purely economic. And it seems to be less about countries now than about massive companies. It's almost as if the companies were taking over the world and sort of colonizing everywhere. So even though we have more media today, and these days we don't know what's true and what's not true in the media at all anymore, maybe the world is even less clear than it was 100 years ago, despite the fact that they had to wait sort of 5 days for any sort of world news. Now supposedly we get it immediately, but we just don't know what's true and what isn't.
Okay, so the absence of these universal ideologies makes the world of 2017 harder to read than the world of 1917, Andrei Garchev?
Yes. Well, going back to 1917, I would say that if we make the list of these different ideologies, we don't have to forget they were providing attempts of answers. And answers to maybe the First World Crisis. It was the world crisis in the form of the First World War. It was the crisis of the colonial system. It was the first crisis, world crisis of capitalism as a world economy. And different ideologies were trying to offer different, opposing, clashing answers to this crisis. Russian Revolution was one of, at that time, very convincing attempts to provide an answer to this crisis, at least for Russia, but also for the world over, with the project of the World Revolution. Well, now, certainly, as you are saying, it's less clear because, first, we are living the age of the end of ideologies and of the collapse and of the, I would say, disappointment with the ideological answer.
Disappointment, that is so important because in that period, there was this belief that the future, even though there was this horrible genocide called World War I unfolding, there was this belief that the future would be better than the present and the past.
That was sort of the idea. I mean, this idea that this was the war to end all wars, that this is making the world safe for democracy, and these kinds of ideas, they were ideas. But I'm not sure that those ideas fulfilled their promise. In fact, I think it's expressed through a very important ideology that prevails today, and that's neoliberalism, which is the force that seems to be binding these nations today. I think that's one of the things that they have that we all share in common is this neoliberal idea that focuses on markets and focuses on issues of trades and focuses on issues of deregulation and these kinds of things, which in a sense undermine, if you will, the traditional role that was played by governments. So now neoliberalism, rather than being just an economic idea, which is how it was Hayek's idea when it was brought over to the University of Chicago back in the 1940s, early 1950s. This has become now a form of governance. And I think that's kind of one of the things
an ideology and a form of governance, you're saying. Now, of course, we talk about the world being this belief in the future, but there was also disillusion, of course. A decorated soldier in World War I, the British poet Siegfried Sassoon, wrote about that disillusion. He wasn't just a poet. A letter of his was read out in Parliament at Westminster in July of 1917. It chastised the public's indifference to suffering. I believe it may help to destroy, he said of his letter, the callous complacency with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not enough imagination to realize. Stephen Clark, you talked about fake news, but more important is indifference to what's unfolding in Aleppo
Well, it was, back then in the war, of course it was fake news, and soldiers like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves and E. Cummings, the writers who actually wrote their memoirs, they actually said that some of them, they didn't even want to come home on leave from the front because they were so sickened by the propaganda that was being put out about, the glorious conflict going on the other side of the channel. So I suppose it's true, there was a lot of fake news back then. And really, that's the trouble is there's no excuse for it now, supposedly, because the Western nations are supposedly at peace now with a supposedly free media, and you're not supposed to have propaganda. Whereas now no one knows who's bombing whom. We see all these civilian casualties, and everyone's denying that they did it. I mean, someone's doing it, and no one's kind of admitting it. And so it is a confused world. Except now we should really have no excuse whatsoever for living in that kind of propaganda world. There should be people out there telling the truth. without endangering people like WikiLeaks seem to do, but, there should be people out there able to reveal what's really going on if someone wants to listen.
Stephen Walt, your thoughts on propaganda then and propaganda now?
Well, I think it's unfortunate and maybe a little facile to believe that we can have a clearer, transparent world today than was present back then. Certainly, there was an enormous amount of wartime propaganda during World War I, but we've seen in recent years that it's possible for governments to continue to manipulate information, whether it's the way in which President Erdogan in Turkey has essentially attempted to muzzle or silence media criticism of his government. Certainly what the Bush administration was able to do in convincing Americans that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was also in cahoots with al-Qaeda. So I don't think we can safely assume that propaganda has disappeared just because we have a wide open media environment. Indeed, we've just elected a president, or at least a president-elect, who sort of sailed into office by offering a series of 140-character tweets, many of which bore little resemblance to factual reality. I did want to draw a parallel, though, between an earlier point. The disillusionment after World War I is, I think, similar to some of the disillusionment we see today. Because when the Cold War ended, many people believed, certainly people in the United States, that we were now poised for an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity. We had reached the end of history, that markets and democracy would spread all over the world under the benevolent leadership of the United States. And if we look at the last 25 years, that promise was not fulfilled just about anywhere. And I think that's what's driving much of the disillusionment we see in Europe, in the United States, and a number of other places around the world.
Andrei Grachev?
Well, going back to propaganda, I would say that maybe a new feature with it is that to a certain extent, and maybe more than it was 100 years ago, propaganda is replacing politics.
Mm-hmm. Replacing
it. And sometimes it's even replacing war, because you are having much more of propaganda wars, happily, probably, than maybe an eventual or a real war, especially a possible nuclear war. But now you're having this kind of virtual propaganda wars, which are, I would say, even more sterile than before, because they don't have ideological background behind them. You are having a confrontation of opposite ideologies with the white and black world, with one against the other, and each one was imagining that he is living on the bright sun of the moon. And now it's all confused. And with the collapse of one utopia, that was the communist dream, that took 70 years, time of the life of the Soviet Union, it took maybe only 25 years for the collapse of the other utopia that we are living now, the neoliberal utopia, because maybe the fatal blow to it was the collapse of communism, because after it was deprived of its mortal enemy, it had to produce its efficiency, and now it's producing confusion and suffering and contrast across the world.
So you always need a foil, is what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Like in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, they have like 3 different big superpowers, but they're kind of in cahoots with one another.
You mean 1984?
1984, yeah.
Exactly. This is which makes, from my point of view, our situation more desperate than before, because you don't have hope for another utopia. I'm in need of utopia if utopia is an equivalent of an ideal.
Do you need a utopia, Curtis Young?
Yeah, we tend to create these utopian ideas. Narrative plays a tremendous role in our understanding of where we are, who we are, this sort of thing. To Andrei's point, in fact, at the end of in 1989, 1990, at the end of the Soviet Union, one of the key moments was Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, where he says, here's our new enemy, because the old traditional enemies, that was finished. And I find it very interesting that out of the Clash of Civilizations, one of the things that happened was the Americans, we created a new think tank, the Project for a New American Century, that was manned by Rumsfeld, Cheney, Richard Pearl, Christoph was a part of it, Wolfowitz was a part of it, and these are the people who went into the new Bush administration in 2000, and we know the
Decided
rest
to
of
invade
history.
Iraq. Yeah.
Exactly. So so this was an attempt, I think, to Andre's point, to manufacture another utopian idea that had as its bedrock neoliberalism, and I think that's the crisis that we're dealing with now.
Stephen Clark.
Yeah, but new utopias are being created all the time. Brexit was the vote was based on this utopian ideal that suddenly London was going to be making every law for the Brits, not Brussels anymore, and that suddenly Britain's economy would take off if it was liberated from Europe. And most people thought that suddenly there would be no more refugees, no more migrants. You know, people wanted to believe the lies. The lies were being pointed out constantly on the internet and in certain parts of the media. But people wanted to believe these utopian lies so much that 52% of them voted for Brexit. And it felt the same with the Trump campaign as well. People were, the sort of lies and nonsense was being pointed out by everybody on the sort of liberal side of the media. And yet there were enough people who wanted to believe in the utopia of this new leader who's going to make America great again. People who believed in that so strongly, they voted for it despite everything. So I think these utopias are still really, really powerful because of this manipulation and the sort of failure to believe the truths that are being told to us, because the untruths are stronger.
When we come back in the special year-end edition of the France 24 debate, we're going to be looking at how, amid all the chaos, sometimes there are moments that are empowering. Good can come out without you noticing it. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.